So let's get started. What is Power BI Dataflow? So Power BI Dataflow is a data preparation tool inside the Power BI, and it was released way back in 2018. Power BI Dataflows are basically like this cloud-based self-service, lightweight data warehouses or data marts inside Power BI that allows organizations to unify data coming from a wide range of sources, prepare the data and publish it so that it can be consumed by the users. And Power BI data flows are always created in the Power BI workspace, and they are the Power Query in the cloud, which is independent of any data set or any reports. Here you can see we have a diagram of the Power BI environment where you can see there are multiple data sources, there are multiple data flows, data sets, reports, and dashboards. So data flows are optional, and you can create data flow by getting data from different sources that are familiar to Power BI. And when you create a data flow, what happens in the backend is a CDM folder, that is a Microsoft Common Data Model folder, gets created in the Azure Data Lake storage. And within that folder, there is a JSON file which gets created, and it contains the metadata of the data flow and CSV files for each entities that contains the data of the entities. So once you have created your data flow in the Power BI workspace, it can then be consumed in your Power BI to create data sets. And in order to be able to do that, you'll have to log in with your Power BI credentials in your Power BI desktop, and you should have access to the workspace where the data flow has been created. So once you have created your data sets using the data flow data and created the measures or the relationships, now your data set is ready to be fed to the visualization layer. So you can either start building a report in the same PBX file where you have the model, or you can publish the data set in the Power BI workspace, and then by creating live connection to the data set, you can start building the reports. And this one benefit of creating live connection is that at one point of time, multiple report developers can like work on the reports. And once you have the reports created, you can publish them across multiple workspaces. So once you have your reports published, now those reports visuals can be used, and you can create dashboards on top of this and drive deep information from your organizational data. So this is where the data flow comes into picture in the Power BI environment. Next, whenever we discuss about data flows, the most commonly asked question is when to use a data flow. So data flows are basically created to support certain scenarios, and I have listed just 3 of them, which I think are really important. Okay, so you can create data flows when you want to reuse the transformation logic that can be shared across many data sets and reports. So data flows always promote the reusability of the underlying data. And by doing this, you can also like prevent the need to create separate connections to your on-premise or your cloud sources. Next, you can also create data flow when you want to have a single source of truth for your analyst and report developers to connect to the data flow rather than connecting to any underlying system, and providing you with the control over which data is accessed and how data is exposed to report creators. In this way, you can also map your data to the industry standards, and this data can be used across multiple um, other the products and services in your organizations. You can also create data flows when you want to prevent analysts from having direct access to the underlying data, thus reducing the load to your data source. Okay, now that we know why and when to create data flows, let me talk about how to create a data flow. So as I mentioned, data flows are always created only in Power BI workspaces, and currently there are 4 different ways to create a data flow. By using the first option, that is the using define new entities, this lets you create a data flow by defining a new entity by connecting to a data source. Here, the experience is very much like creating a table in Power Query, but the details are a bit different. The next option to create a data flow is by using the import model. So here in using this option, you can create a data flow by using a JSON file. And this option is really helpful when you have already created a data flow in a workspace and you want to recreate it or move it to a different workspace. The third option to create a data flow is by using linked entity from another data flow. So this lets you create a data flow by referencing to an entity that has already been created in another data flow. And this is a premium feature. So your workspace should come under premium capacity in order to be able to create linked entities. And the fourth option to create a data flow is by using attached common data model folder. So using this option, you can create a data flow by connecting to a CDM folder in the Azure Data Lake storage. And for this option, you should have a Azure Data Lake account. So using any of the 4 options, you can create a data flow. And once you create a data flow, you will be prompted to refresh the data flow. And refreshing the data flow will execute the query for each entity within the data flow, and it will populate the underlying Azure Data Lake storage with the result of the query. And only after refreshing a data flow, you can consume the data of the data flow. Okay, next that one, we have created the data flow. Now we need to configure the data flow. So whoever creates the data flow by default becomes the owner of the data flow. And if you are not the owner of the data flow, the only thing you can do is refresh the data flow, and you won't be able to edit it or make any changes like setting up the gateways or changing the data source credentials. Or so in order to be able to do that, you will have to inherit the data flow from the owner. That is, you'll have to take over the ownership, and only the owner of the data flow can then choose if the data flow needs a gateway, and he can set it up. The owner can also change the data source credentials and decide how to connect to the data source. The owner can also then schedule the refresh, that is set up times for the data flow to refresh. Now, after configuring your data flow, it is ready to be consumed. And your data flow can be consumed in 3 different ways. It can either be consumed in a data flow by creating a linked entity, and this allows a author of another data flow to use your data. It can also be consumed in a data set to allow users to use your data and create reports. And the third option is by um, it can be consumed by some external tools that can read from the CDM format by creating a connection. Okay, types of data flow entities. So data flows are basically, it's a collection of entities. And unlike data sets, data flows have different types of entities: the normal entity or the standard entities. In It's the entities in the Power Query that gets created whenever you create by connecting to a data source. And this is how an entity would look like in the data flow. Next, we have the linked entity. So linked entities are the entities in Power BI Dataflow that references entities in another data flow without duplicating it in a read-only fashion. And linked entities can go down to a depth of 32 references. And you cannot add additional transformation steps on top of a linked entity. And this is how a linked entity would look like in the data flow. It has a icon, a link icon. And the third type is the computed entity. So computed entities are entities that references another entity and perform operations on top of it in a write-only fashion. And computed entities at the time of refresh references to the result of the source entity and then implements the transformation steps and produces the result. It does not reference to the data source. And this is how the computed entity looks like in a data flow. It has a lightning icon. And data flow capacities are available to both pro and premium capacity. However, there are certain features that are only available to the premium capacity. For connectivity, it's same for pro and premium. Incremental updates, that is only available to premium. Computed entities and linked entities are also only available to premium. The refresh rates for pro, it is 8 times a day, and for premium, it's up to 48 times a day, which is a lot. AI capabilities are only available to premium, and storage wise for pro, it's 10 GB per user, whereas for premium, it's 100 TB for P1 or any greater nodes. And the data ingestion for pro is serial, whereas for premium it's parallel, hence you could experience a faster refreshes. And depending on your organizational's requirement, you can decide which license would be beneficial if you decide to use. Next, the pros and cons of data flows. There are a lot of pros of using data flows, and I have listed just a few of them. So centralized data warehouse. Data flows can be your centralized data warehouse where you can store all your Power BI data, Power BI source data in one place in the format that is needed for you to do the reporting. Next, multiple Power BI reports can use one Power query table. So if you have created your entities in the data flow with all the transformation steps, and that entity needs to be used in multiple data sets, and in future, if there is any change or modification, you don't have to go to each and every data set and make the changes. Instead, there's just one point where you need to go and make the changes, and after the refresh of the data set, it would be available in all the data sets. So it saves a lot of time and cost. The third point which I mentioned, which I have pointed out, is different data source with different schedule of refresh. So for example, in your organization, if you have a set of entities that needs to be refreshed either daily or hourly, and if you have another set of entities that needs to be refreshed once a week or maybe once a month. So it's like in Dataflow, we have the option to create separate data flows for those type of entities and schedule the refresh accordingly. And this saves a lot of resource consumption. Next is the import and export data flows from your workspace to another. So if in your environment, if in your organization, if you have multiple environments, like for example, in the development environment where you do all your development works, you create your data flow with all the transformation steps and everything. And once it is ready to be push to the production environment or any other intermediate environment, you do not have to recreate the data flow by doing all the steps. All you need to do is export the JSON file from your development environment and push it to the, and push it, when I say push it, I mean and you can import it to your destination workspace. And this can save a lot of time. Schedule incremental refresh. So data flows, you can set up the schedule incremental refreshes. And if you have large fact tables, it's always advisable to set up the schedule incremental refresh. And by doing that, you can save a lot of refresh time, resource consumptions. And this schedule incremental refresh can be set up in the entity level. It's not at the data flow level. And as I mentioned, there are additional benefits of using data flows, and I have listed just few of them. But we do have some cons, and the first one is data flows can only be modified by the owner. So for a data flow, only one person can be a owner at a time, and only the owner can make the changes. However, if someone else has to make changes, the person can take over the ownership and make the changes. The second point which I highlighted is the data flows are not available in my workspaces. So you cannot create a data flow in your personal workspace, that is my workspace, because data flows are designed to reshare, and my workspace is designed not to reshare or reuse it. And the third limitation is data lineage feature at workspace level. So for the data flow, the lineage view is at the workspace level. And for example, if you have published your data flow in one workspace and some other report developers used your data flow and created a data set and published it in other workspace, then from in your workspace, if you look at the lineage view, it will not show up. And this is a limitation, especially when there are multiple workspaces in your environment and you have multiple report developers. It might become a little difficult to keep track of all the data sets that you use in your data. Okay, data flow best practices. So it's always a good practice to keep your data flow optimized and organized. Always try to push all the transformation steps down to your data flow and keep the as limit the number of transformation steps in your data set, and in this way you can keep everything in one place and in a consistent way. Next is give an explanatory name to every data flow, and always try to group the similar entities within a data flow together. So this becomes helpful when you have a bunch of entities in your data flow. Next is reuse your data flows as much as you can, and always try to avoid creating same entity in your data flow, especially when you have like a lot of data flow owners, and sometimes it might be difficult to keep track of where are like who created which entity. So it's always better to have a data dictionary or like a data flow entity dictionary. Next, take advantage of linked and computed entities. So if you have a premium capacity, always try to take the advantage of it. Similarly, if you have um, a premium capacity, always do incremental refresh for large data sets, especially when your historical data is static. Parameterize your entities. It's always a good practice to parameterize your entities, especially when you want to refactor the entities. Now, back up your data flows. So this is something we all know, and I think but most of the time we just miss this point, but this is really important. You should back up your data flows, especially because if accidentally you delete your data flow from your workspace, there's no way to revert back the change. So it's always advisable to keep a backup of the JSON file and put it in some shared location. Okay, now that we have covered the basics of data flow, let me drive to the demo session. And here I will switch my screen and go to the Power BI service. Can someone please confirm if you can see my Power BI service?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Okay, so here I am logged in my Power BI service, and in the left navigation pane, you can see workspaces. I'm going to click on this workspaces menu. So this will show me the list of workspaces that I have permission to access. And for this demo purpose, I'm going to use this premium workspace. And this premium workspace, next to this premium workspace, you can see there's a diamond icon which confirms that it is a premium capacity. So I'm going to click on premium workspace. Under premium workspace there, yeah, you can see here we have this link to new. I'm going to click on new. Then I'm going to click on data flow. Here you can see it will show all the 4 options using which you can create a data flow. So for now, I'm going to use the first option, that is define new entities. And I'm going to click on add new entities. Once I click that, it will open the window with all the different data sources that are available to Power BI Dataflow. And for this demo purpose, I'm going to bring in a file which is in SharePoint Online. And for that, I'm just going to click on the blank query and maybe paste the query which I have already created for this demo purpose. And since this is SharePoint Online, I don't have to worry about the gateway. So I'll just keep it none and then click on hit this next. So now I will have to specify how to connect to the data source. I'm going to use my organizational account, click connect. So here I have my data. I'm going to rename this entity. So click right click, then rename, maybe name it as population. And this experience would be like similar to the Power Query if you're familiar to Power Query. And if I want to do some transformation steps, then under Home ribbon, there are the options. I'm going to use the first row as my header. And if I expand this one, you can see all the transformation steps that I'll be adding. It will show up in this visual. Next, for example, if I want to change, just format the names of my header. Just to keep it consistent. And if I want to replace this 2020, the year, I'm going to replace value. Okay. Let me just go back to the previous step, or maybe get rid of this step instead of troubleshooting it, just for a quick fix. We are having some unexpected error. Let me try to save and close and see if that works. Or okay, so once you save, hit the save and close, you will be prompted with this window where you will have to enter the, you'll have to provide the name. And I'm going to uh, give this data flow demo one name. And it's always a good practice to describe your data flow. And then click the save. And once you created the data flow, you have only created the schema and the structure. So you'll have to refresh your data flow before it can populate the data to the underlying Azure Data Lake storage. So for that, if I go to my premium workspace and look here that we have created the first data flow, and I'll have to click on the refresh button so that it can be consumed by data sets or other data flows. So now that we have created our first data flow, if I want to rename it, then you have to click on this ellipsis and go to properties. And here you can rename the data flow or make any uh, description change. I'm going to save it. So the next thing you want to do is configure the data flow. And in order to configure the data flow, you have to go to the settings. And in settings, you can see since I created the data flow, so by default, I'm the owner of this data flow. Here you can look at the refresh history. Here you'll have all the refresh history and the type of the refresh, whether it was an on-demand or a scheduled refresh, and also you'll get the status if it's completed or failed. Next thing, you can set up the gateway connection. Since I'm using SharePoint as my data source, I do not want any gateway to be set up. So I'm going to turn this off. And data source credentials, I can always come back in and change the credentials if I have to. And this way I can also like change the way I would like to connect to the data source. I'm going to cancel this. Next is schedule refresh. Here you can set up the refresh. For example, if you turn it on, you can set up the refresh for daily or a weekly basis. You can also choose the time zone you want to pick and then add the time. So for Pro, as I mentioned, you can enter like you can set up 8 refreshes a day, whereas for Premium, you can set up 48 refreshes a day. I'm going to discard this for now. So this is how you can create a data flow in your Power BI workspace. This is one example. The other example is by creating linked entities. So let me show you how to do that. So same thing, you have to go to new and then go to data flow. Here I'll choose the second option, that is linked entities from other data flows. Click on add linked entities and I'm going to sign in. Here we have, when you click next, you will get the list of all the data flows that I have permission to access. And for this demo purpose, I'm going to use the same entity that we have just created in our demo one data flow. If I click select this, and then next I'm going to do a transform data. Here you can see this is our linked entity which got created, and here you can see the link icon. So this entity does not connect for To get this entity populated, it does not connect to the data source, rather it connects to the source entity, which is in our demo1 data flow. So now that we have created this one, I'm going to save and close it and name this data flow as demo uh, 2. And this is a linked entity, and this is only available to premium capacities. Just a side note. So now you can see we have the two data flows created. And now the third option to create a data flow is by the import uh, model option. And for that, you can create the data flow by using a JSON file of a data flow. So I'm going to use the same demo one. I'm going to download the JSON file of this one and then create a, a third data flow using that JSON file. So for that, you need to click on the ellipsis and then click on export.json. So it will be downloaded in my local machine. And let me show you how this JSON file looks like. So I'm going to open this with my Notepad++ and maybe format it to JSON. So here you can see we have this data flow uh, demo one, but since I'm going to use this data flow and create a new data flow, I'm going to name it something else, demo 3. Here you can see we have the source URL, we have the entities, name population, we have all the attributes of that entity with the data type. So this is the metadata. And I'm going to save this one as, I'm going to name it as demo 3 and save this JSON. Now that we have this JSON file, we are ready to create our third data flow using the JSON file. Again, I'll go back to Premium Workspaces, click on New, then go to Data Flow and use this third option, Import Model. Click on Import Model, then choose the file, the JSON file demo3, and then open it. So if I go back to the workspace and see, we have got our third data flow created. And if I want to edit this data flow, click on the ellipsis, go to edit. And here you can see we have the same entity created that we had in our demo one data flow. So this is really helpful when you have a bunch of entities and you want to recreate the same data flow in another workspace. And so using the third option, this is how we created the data flow. Now let's look at the fourth option. So again, I'm going to click on New, Data Flows. And here's the fourth option, attach a common data model folder. And this is under preview. So click on create and attach. You need to enter your data flow name. And here you need to provide the path of the CDM folder, which has already been created by some other application, and it's in your Azure Data Lake account. And that's all. And then click the create and attach. But I do not have an Azure account, so I won't be able to create the data flow using this option. But that is how you could create one. Okay, now that I've showed you how to create entities and linked entities, let me quickly also show you how to create a computed entity. So here we have this population, which is a linked entity. And if I want to create another computed entity here, is I'll have to do a right click and click reference. And that is how a computed entity got created. And one trick is that if for linked entity, you cannot add additional transformation steps. But if we need to, then one workaround is create a computed entity and then you can add transformation steps. Like for example, let me try to do it here. Maybe get rid of the 2020 here. 2021, sorry. There you go. So we can, this is a good workaround. And if I want to make a change here, change the data type, maybe make it a whole number and save and close. So in this, like using any of these options, you can create a data flow. And now that we have created a data flow, we want to consume the data of this and create report. So for that, you need to go to your Power BI desktop here, and under this home ribbon, click on the get data, and I want to get the data from my Power BI Dataflow. So I'm going to click on Power BI Dataflow, which will give me the list of all the data flows that I have permission to access. I'm going to select one of the data flow that we have just created, maybe the computed one. So there we have our data flow with all the data. So okay, here you can see, so one advantage, it's like definitely in future if you want to make any changes and in this table, and this table is being used in multiple data sets, then we do not have to make these changes in each of the data sets. It's just go to the data flow, make the changes, and when you refresh your data set, it will be reflected here. So we have our data flow, data consumed in this data set. Now, if I want to create a measure for this data set, like for example, I'll quickly create a measure. And one of the best practice is instead of creating measures in the same entity, it's always a good practice to create a separate table. And I'm going to name it as key measures. And create the measure in this new table that I just created. Name it as a total population, maybe. And let me quickly create another measure. And I want to format this as a decimal number with the comma separator. and quickly get rid of this column that we are not going to use anywhere. So this is the data set that we just created by consuming the data flow. And I'm going to save this one as data set. So in this PBIX file, I can start building reports. But as I mentioned earlier, if I publish this data set, then multiple report developers can create a live connection and simultaneously start building reports. And so this is a best practice. And I'm going to show you how to create a live connection to this data set. Let me first publish this in the same workspace where I have created the data flows. So this is premium workspace and I'll select that. Okay, got it. So let's go and check our workspace if our data set got created. So there it is. So here you can see for the data flow, there's a different icon, and for a data set, the icon is different. Now that we have created our data set, I can open a new file, report file. And here, now I'm going to get the data from the data set that we just published, Power BI data set. And select the data set that we just created and create. Here you can see in the bottom right, it says that this is connected live to the Power BI dataset population dataset. So I'm going to quickly build a very simple Power BI report. So just bring in two cards, the total population. Give the average population here. And if I want, I can also change the data label display units. Let me make it thousands to be consistent. And just quickly bring in a table, maybe state, total population. So once we have our report created, we can then publish it. So I'm going to save this one and name it as population report. Save it. And I'm going to publish this report in the same workspace, but we can also publish it in different workspace. We don't have to publish it in the same workspace where we have our data set or our data flow. Now, if we come back to this workspace, maybe refresh it once. Here you can see under content, we have our new report that we just created called population report. And this report called population dataset, it automatically gets created when we have published this population dataset. Now, if I want to look at the lineage of this data flow, I need to go to the ellipsis, click the ellipsis, then click on view lineage. It will give me the lineage. So here you can see the source of this report population is this data set called population data set, and the source of this data set is our demo 2, where we have created the linked entity, and the source of that linked entity is the demo 1 data flow that we have created by connecting to the Excel sheet which was in my SharePoint. So this is how you can look at the lineage. And here, if you click on this show lineage, click on the data flow, here you can see you will have like all the entity information. Like for this data flow, it has only one entity named population. And if I want to look at data flow 2, here I have two entities. One is the linked entities and the other one is the computed entity. If I click on the data sets, I can also look at all the tables that we have in this data set. And like I mentioned, in Power BI Dataflow, we do not have the option to view in the how it is impacting in other workspaces. But for data sets, we can do that, show impact across other workspaces. Right now, this data set is being used by only one report, which is in only one workspace, and this is the report. Actually two, because when we publish this data set, this report automatically got created. So that is how you can view the lineage. And if you want users to use your data flow, you'll have to give them access to the workspace. So, and in order to give them access, you will have to go to the access, and here you can add your team members and assign the role and then add them. Now, if I want to go back to the list view, I'm going to click on view and click list. So that is all about how to create data flows, how to consume the data flow and create a data set, and then by creating live connections, how to create reports, and ultimately how to give access to your data flow, view the lineage at the same.
Zenifa, maybe you want to back up that one slide in case people want to take screenshots of that.
Yeah, sure.
We will make this recording available. The URL for it is in the chat. I saw that got posted by Mark Doherty, and it'll be posted the next 4 or 5 days on that URL. Thank you, Zenifa. And question, yeah, very well done. See lots of comments about that. I know you've presented this before, and it shows, Zenifa. Nice work. And questions for Zenifa, you can. I know there's been a really active chat during this presentation. A lot of good input from other attendees.
I see that you're using your Power BI Premium subscription or whatever, right? So when you're using Power BI, how do you make use of the Azure storage Gen 2 storage, I guess? So what are the benefits of using the Gen 2 storage accounts?
So for this to create data flows, you do not have to have any Azure storage account. So it will come with your Power BI license, whether it's a Pro or Premium. The only time that you need a Azure storage account is when you want to create a data flow by pointing to a CDM folder that's in the Azure Data Lake storage. But other than that, you do not need any. You do
So
not need an account.
basically, you're using the Azure storage to save your PBIX files. Is that all it is?
So in the backend, it gets stored, but yes, we do not have to worry about creating any account. So it comes with the Power BI. It's part of the Power BI service, so we do not have to worry about it.
Okay. Thank you.
Welcome.
Since you have that data flow created, would you mind showing us how you save that to storage Gen 2 storage?
Okay, so let me share my screen quickly.
This is Angel. Just want to add a little bit of color also to the Gen 2 question is if you have a need to populate Gen 2 yourself, say you're downloading data from APIs or whatever, and you want to inject it outside of the service, you don't want to use Power BI, you don't want to use the Power BI gateway, maybe you have Azure Data Factory and you've got or Azure Functions or Azure Automation that's populating your Gen 2, then your data flow can pick it up from that alternate Gen 2 storage. But what Zenifa is about to show you right now is, how to save it in the embedded Gen 2 storage that's already behind, that's backing the Power BI service. It doesn't store your Power BI files, it stores your data. And regardless of whether you use your own account or you use the built-in one with the service, this does have a lot better performance. So, we've seen it with data sources like Redshift, data sources like Snowflake, where refresh times can be very, very slow hitting those cloud data warehouses directly. Using this intermediate data flow as a mechanism for bringing your data into Power BI will make your data set refreshes just a heck of a lot faster. And also in certain scenarios, it can make Power BI development a heck of a lot faster too.
Right.
And what about security for that data that's in the storage Gen 2? Could those data be made public, or is it just open to just the company, I guess, the subscriber, I guess?
Yeah, when you set up Data Lake Gen 2 storage, you have the option to make it public or private.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, Zenifa.
Okay, yeah, so whenever we create a data flow and save it, it automatically gets a CDM folder gets created in the Azure storage. And if you want to save this file, you will have to go to click on the ellipsis and then click on the export.json file. And this is how the JSON file looks like. This is the metadata of the data flow. But all the underlying datas would be stored in the Azure Data Lake storage.
Okay. So this is just the metadata. Okay.
Right. Yep.
So if you were to go through the Azure portal, would you be able to show where the data is there as well then? Or is that hidden from everybody else?
Yes, it's hidden, and I do not have an Azure account, so I cannot log in there. So it's like backed up by, it's like given by the Azure subscription, the Power BI subscription that we used.
Okay. All right. Thank you.